Alright, so we're going to go through the homework that was assigned last class. It asked us in the first part to determine if the following shapes are similar, and if they are, explain why. Remember that if shapes are similar, their sides are proportional. So we can see that the short side of this rectangle should correspond with the short side on this one, and then the longer side would correspond with this longer side. So we can set up a proportion and say that 4 over 12 should equal 2 over 6. And if this is a true proportion, then when we cross multiply, we should get two equal numbers. So 4 times 6 is 24. When we cross multiply the other way, 12 times 2 is 24. So because these sides made a true proportion, then yes, this is a similar set of shapes. And then in our next one, we have XZ right here is the hypotenuse on this triangle, and AC is the hypotenuse on that triangle. So those two sides correspond. And then we also have these set of corresponding sides here. So we want to set up a proportion with these corresponding sides to see whether or not these shapes are proportional. So I'm going to put 5 over 2 equals 25 over 10. That has all my pinks on top and my yellows on the bottom. When we cross multiply, 5 times 10 is 50, and 2 times 25 is also 50. So again, we got a true proportion for those corresponding sides, so yes, these shapes are similar. In number 2, they tell us right away that the shapes are similar, so that means we know we're allowed to set up our proportion. So again, you want to find these corresponding sides. So in this first rectangle, we're looking for side BC. That's going to correspond to side KL in the smaller rectangle. And if you notice, those two sides are both the shorter sides of their rectangle. And then we have side CD, that's going to be right here. That's going to correspond to LM, which is right here. So we have these corresponding sides here. Notice that these rectangles were turned so that the shorter side was facing up on this one, whereas it was facing to the side here. So you don't want to just assume that X and 24 go together because they were on top and bottom, and 57 and 8 are on the sides. They weren't facing the same way, so we can't just assume that. If you use your letters, you'll be able to figure out those corresponding sides. So we can put X over 57 and set that equal to 8 over 24. When we cross multiply, we get 24x, 456, and then we divide by 24 on both sides. So x should equal 19, and the label that we want on that is inches. In our next example, we have triangle ABC is similar to triangle JKL. So we're trying to figure out what side X is right here. That's LK. And those are the last two letters, so that means that that's going to correspond to BC. So again, these similar shapes are not facing the same way this time, just like the rectangles weren't, so you have to use those letters to help you decide what order they're going in. Now that we know their corresponding sides, we can set up our proportion. So I'm going to put 72 over 12 and set that equal to 18 over x. That's my yellow over pink and yellow over pink. That gets us 72x equals 216. And then we're going to divide by 72 on both sides. So x equals 3. We're going to say 3 centimeters here. As we keep going, these two are giving us some more application type problems, but it's still the same idea with our similar figures. So it's asking us to figure out in this first problem, how tall is the building? So our building height is right here, it's our x. That's going to match up with our tree height over here, which is 10. And then the shadow and the shadow are also going to match up. So we're going to use those numbers to help us set up a proportion. We're going to put x over 75 equal to 10 over 15. So then I've put all the heights on top and all the shadows on the bottom. And then this was all about the building, this is all about the tree. When we cross multiply, we get 15x equals 750. And we'll divide by 15 on both sides. So that's going to end up getting us that x equals 50. And we're talking about a height of the building, and it was being measured in feet. So 50 feet seems like a reasonable answer for the height of a building if that tree was about 10. And then in our next problem, we have Harold is standing next to a building whose shadow is 15 feet long. If Harold is 6 feet tall and casting a 2.5-foot shadow, how tall is the building? So you wanted to try to draw something that's similar to this picture that they gave us in the last one. So they're saying we have a building, and they're telling us that the shadow is 15 feet. We don't know how tall the building is, but we know that we also have Harold, and he's 6 feet tall, and his shadow is only 2.5 feet. So his height is going to correspond with the height of the building, and then his shadow will correspond with the length of the building shadow. When you draw the picture, it's a little bit easier to kind of see which numbers go together. That lets us set up a proportion that looks like x over 15 equals 6 over 2.5. When we cross multiply, we get 2.5x equals 90. And then we divide by 2.5 on both sides. X equals 36 feet, since that's what we were measuring in. And again, that seems like a reasonable height for a building. When we move on to the back, we have some of this vocabulary and notation with similar figures. We have triangle fox, so F-O-X, is similar to triangle fan, F-A-N. Which side of fox corresponds to side A-N? If it helps you to draw these separately, you can always take this one that's on top here, that's smaller, and redraw it outside of the larger one, and then you can kind of just ignore that inner one then. And if you do that and just kind of cross those things out, then you're kind of seeing two separate triangles that we're used to seeing there. So we had triangle F-O-X is similar to triangle F-A-N, and then they're asking us to figure out which side corresponds to A-N. Well, there's two ways we can do it. We can look and see, well, those are the second and third letters, so O-X would have to be the second and third letters. Or if you're looking at them separately, A-N is the bottom, and O-X is in the bottom, and they're facing the same way because F is on top for both of them. So there's a few different ways to do that, but our final answer ends up being that it corresponds to side OX, and we write it with the side notation like that. We can do the same thing over in the next one. You could always redraw it separately if you wanted to, but in this case they're asking you which angle of fox corresponds to angle N. Angle N is that third letter, so the third letter in fox is X. So that means that these two angles will be corresponding to one another. So we would write that as angle X. In number 5, we're circling each of the true statements, so you might want to mark some colors on here. They tell us that A, B, C is similar to triangle D, E, F. That would mean that side AB is that first two letters that's going to be corresponding to DE. B, C is going to be to EF, so BC and EF. And then our last two are going to be DF and AC, so those are the other ones that we haven't marked. So when we read this first statement, it says side AB is congruent to DE. They may look like they're about the same length. We only know right now that the two triangles are similar, so their sides are in proportion to one another. They're not necessarily congruent, so we can't say that that's true. Angle A is congruent to angle F. Well, A is the first letter and F is the third, so those two angles do not correspond, which means that they are probably not going to be congruent. There's a chance that they could be, but we don't know for sure, and based on the similarity relationship there, we can't say that they are. Here we have side AB, and we marked that green, over DE, that's also green. And then they put AC and DF, and we left those as just the plain black lines. So far our lines match up here. If I check these, AB and AC are both on top, and they're from this triangle right here. DE and DF are both on the bottom, and that's from this triangle. So it looks like we've made a hashtag, and this would be a true proportion. In our next one, we have angle F is congruent to angle B, and B is that second letter, F is the third letter. So again, those are in different locations, so they are not going to be corresponding, which means that they're not necessarily congruent. They could be, but we don't know for sure. We have AC over DE, and we called AC nothing. DE we labeled as green, and then AB we labeled as green, and DF we didn't make anything. So on top it looks like they're from the same triangle, on the bottom they're from the same triangle, but if I go to match up my green sides to my green sides, I'm not going to make a hashtag. I'm going to end up getting an X here, so that's not true. And then finally we have angle B is congruent to angle E. Well, B and E are both in the middle of their triangle names, so they are corresponding. And in similar figures, we know that corresponding angles are congruent. So BE would have to be angle B and angle E have to be congruent here. In our last problem, they tell us that triangle WVU is similar to triangle ZYX. So we need to fill in the blanks for what letters we can put in here, whether it's a triangle name, an angle, or a side. So the first statement says that if we have triangle XYZ, what would that be similar to? Well, X in our original one was that third letter, which means we need to start with U here. Y is that second letter there. That was our second letter originally as well, so V needs to come next. And then Z was our first letter, and our first letter over here was W. So we're just going to use those orders there to help us. Angle X has two markings on it, and the markings will have two on the other one is angle U. WV is right here from one marking to three markings, and that's over ZY, which is one marking to three markings. And then we have UV, which is from two markings to three markings, so the one that will be similar to that will be the one from 2 to 3 right here, which is side XY. Then we had angle V is congruent to, that's going to have three markings, and so that will be congruent to angle Y. Side ZY, we know that it's corresponding to side WV, but we want to know how long is it. So we need to set up a proportion, and I'm going to be solving this value right here. So I'm going to say 4 over x equals 3 over 12, and use some of the values that I know to help me solve for this missing one. When we cross multiply, we get 48 equals 3x, and when we divide by 3 on both sides, we end up getting 16 equals x. So when they ask for the side ZY, we would say that it's 16. And there's no units on here, so we're going to leave it as just 16. In our last one, we have VU is going from 3 to 2, and then that's corresponding to YX, which is 3 to 2. And then it tells us WU, and that's from 1 to 2 markings, so that's going to correspond to this side here from 1 to 2 markings, which was ZX.